We were looking for an escape. That's what we told ourselves when we booked the lodge. Something off the grid, far from our phones, emails, and the constant hum of civilization. We weren't city people exactly. Ethan had grown up in the mountains of Oregon, Matt and Julia spent most of their childhood hiking with their parents, and Rachel had spent summers at her grandparents' cabin in Minnesota. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I wasn't opposed to the idea of roughing it for a weekend, especially if it meant getting away from the stress of my job. So, when Ethan found the listing for a secluded lodge in the Montana wilderness for dirt cheap, we jumped at the opportunity. The pictures showed a rustic wooden lodge nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees with a small creek nearby. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, perfect. We loaded up Matt's SUV on a Friday morning and started the 6-hour drive from Missoula. The road stretched on, winding through dense forests and empty highways that seemed to go on forever. The last half hour was on a barely maintained dirt road, bumping and rattling as the trees closed in around us. "Feels like a damn horror movie," Julia joked, peering out the window. Rachel laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Let's hope we don't find some creepy old man warning us to turn back." But there was no old man, no other cars, no houses, just the road and the trees. When we finally reached the lodge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked older than it did in the pictures, more weathered. The wood was faded, the porch sagging slightly, and the windows dark, empty, like the place hadn't been touched in years. "Cozy," Ethan muttered as he stepped out of the car. We grabbed our bags and hesitated for a moment before heading inside. The front door groaned on its hinges as we pushed it open, revealing a dim, musty interior. The air smelled of dust and something faintly rotten, like old wood left to decay. The furniture was old, mismatched. Someone's abandoned vacation home turned rental property. The fireplace was large, dominating one side of the room, with an old bearskin rug stretched out in front of it. A narrow wooden staircase led up to a loft with 2 small bedrooms, while a tiny kitchen sat in the back. Despite the unsettling first impression, we unpacked, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of intrusion. After dinner, we decided to explore the area before it got too dark. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. The farther we walked, the heavier the air seemed to get, like the forest was pressing in on us. That's when we found it. A small graveyard hidden in the trees behind the lodge. The gravestones were old, cracked, some leaning at odd angles. Most of the names were unreadable, the engravings worn down by time. A few had dates, 1800s, early 1900s. But there were no signs of any buildings, no indication of a town or settlement nearby. "This is weird," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Think it belonged to whoever owned the lodge before?" Matt suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's just abandoned like the lodge." But something about it felt wrong. The air was heavier here, colder, despite the lingering warmth of the setting sun. "Let's head back," Julia said, shifting uneasily. No one argued. As we walked away, I could have sworn I heard something move behind us. A faint rustling, like someone stepping through the underbrush. I didn't turn around. That night, we built a fire in the old stone fireplace, cooking hot dogs and drinking beer. We tried to joke, to shake off the weirdness of the graveyard, but the atmosphere had shifted. The shadows in the corners of the lodge seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. At some point, the fire started to dim, the logs blackening faster than they should. I threw another piece of wood on, but the flames only flickered, struggling to stay alive. "That's weird," Ethan muttered, watching as the fire sputtered. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps on the porch. We all froze, the room plunging into silence. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered. No one answered. Then a slow creak, like weight shifting on old wood. Matt grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. The porch was empty. "Must be an animal," Julia said, though she didn't sound convinced. I forced a laugh. "A deer trying to knock?" We tried to go back to normal, but the tension didn't leave. That night, as I lay in bed upstairs, I could hear it again. Soft, deliberate steps on the porch, moving slowly from one side to the other. Then, something brushing against the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Eventually, the sound stopped. But I didn't sleep. The next day, we decided to cut the trip short. Something was wrong with the lodge. As we packed, Ethan went up to the attic to check for extra blankets. He was up there for maybe a minute before he came down, his face pale. "What's wrong?" Rachel asked. He swallowed. "There's a bed up there." "So?" He shook his head. "It's made, like someone's been sleeping in it." A cold wave of dread washed over me. No one had gone up there. We'd been the only ones in the lodge, right? A loud creak echoed from the attic. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the attic door. The air turned ice cold. We grabbed our bags and bolted. As we piled into the SUV, I risked one last glance at the lodge. For a second, just a second, I saw something in the window. A dark figure, standing in the loft, staring down at us. We drove, we didn't stop, we never spoke about it again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The sound of slow, heavy footsteps overhead. I didn't talk about what happened at the lodge. None of us did. We left Montana in complete silence, driving until we saw the distant glow of city lights, as if that alone could erase what we'd experienced. We told ourselves it was just our imaginations, an old house settling, the tricks of a tired mind. But deep down, I knew better. The weight of those unseen eyes, the sound of those deliberate footsteps, I still hear them, even now. That was 2 months ago. Life went back to normal, or at least that's what I told myself. The sleepless nights, the way I found myself avoiding mirrors in the dark, the unease I felt when I was alone, it was probably just stress. That's what I told Noah when he called, suggesting a weekend fishing trip. "You need to get out of your head, man," he said, his voice light, coaxing. "Daniel and I found this river spot up north. No cell service, no crowds. Just us, the water, and a couple of days away from whatever's been eating at you." I hesitated. The idea of another isolated trip sent a cold pulse through me, but this was different. This wasn't some ancient lodge with a graveyard hidden behind it. It was the woods, a river. It was normal. So I said yes. Noah picked me up at dawn, Daniel already in the passenger seat, grinning like he had a secret. "You're gonna love this place," he said as we started the drive. "Locals say it's untouched." Like stepping back in time. We drove north, the landscape shifting from open highways to dense forests, the kind that felt endless. The last stretch was on a dirt road barely wide enough for the truck. The trees pressed in, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. By the time we reached the river, the sun was beginning its slow descent, bathing everything in gold. The water was glassy, untouched, reflecting the towering pines that lined its banks. It was beautiful, the kind of place that made you forget the world existed beyond it. We set up camp near the water, a small clearing just big enough for our tent and a fire pit. The air smelled fresh, the silence peaceful. Noah cracked open a beer, stretching his legs as Daniel assembled the rods. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. We fished until sunset, the river calm, the world still. It felt safe, normal. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for months started to ease. Then I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that the fading light was warping the tree line. But no, he was there, standing just beyond the thick brush on the other side of the river. A man. Not fishing, not moving, just standing, watching us. I nudged Noah, nodding toward the figure. "You see that?" Noah squinted, frowning. "Yeah? What the hell is he doing out here?" Daniel waved a hand. "Probably another camper," but the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. He wasn't dressed like a camper. His clothes looked wrong, torn, stiff like they hadn't moved in a long time. His hair was long, unkempt, hanging over his face. I couldn't see his eyes. The sun dipped lower, the light casting long shadows. Still, the man didn't move. Noah shrugged, turning back to his rod. "He's not bothering us. If he wanted to, he would have come over by now." I forced myself to look away, focusing on the gentle lapping of the water. Maybe Noah was right. Maybe he was just some hermit, someone who lived off the land. By the time night fell, the man was gone. We sat around the fire, laughing, drinking, telling stories like we had 100 times before. The tension from earlier faded, replaced by warmth, by the glow of the flames against the dark. Then came the first splash. It wasn't a fish. It was a sound too deliberate, too measured, like someone throwing a rock into the water. We all turned toward the river, our laughter dying. The fire crackled, the only sound in the growing silence. Another splash, bigger this time. Closer. The hair on my arms rose. Daniel forced a chuckle, probably just no one spoke. Something was in the river. A shuffling sound came from the darkness behind us. Leaves crunching, slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter of our camp. My breath caught. Noah grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the trees. Nothing. The woods were empty. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Okay, not funny. Noah shook his head. It's not me. I stood, my heartbeat a dull roar in my ears. Let's just go inside the tent. None of us argued. We zipped the tent shut, our breaths slow, measured. We lay in the darkness, listening. The river was silent. Then came the tapping, soft, rhythmic, against the fabric of the tent. I clenched my teeth, forcing my breath to stay even. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. Noah's voice was barely a whisper. That's not an animal. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the damp earth, the stillness of the trees. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not leading toward the tent, leading from the water. A single set, wet, starting at the riverbank and ending right outside our tent. My stomach lurched. We need to go. Daniel looked at me, confused. What? I grabbed my boots, my bag. We need to go, now. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. Noah saw it too. His face paled, his lips pressing into a thin line. He started packing without another word. Daniel was slower to react, but the urgency in my voice must have registered. Within minutes, we had thrown everything into the truck. The forest watched as we climbed inside. As we pulled away, I glanced toward the river one last time. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows over the water, and there, standing in the shallows, was the man. Still, watching, his head tilted, as if listening. His reflection rippled, distorting him into something inhuman. Then, the water swallowed him whole. I hit the gas. We didn't stop until we reached the highway, the safety of civilization breaking the spell that place had over us. None of us spoke. We never went back. I don't know what we saw that night, I don't want to know, but I haven't been near a river since. I stopped talking to Noah and Daniel after that trip. Not for any reason I could explain. There were no fights, no accusations, no awkward conversations trying to rationalize what we saw. We just drifted apart, as if whatever had been in that river still lingered between us, pulling us in separate directions. I wasn't the same after that night. Sleep didn't come easily. I started leaving lights on, double-checking locks, avoiding dark windows and still water. It was irrational, I knew that, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. That weight of being watched, of something just beyond the edges of sight. That's when I took the contract in Colorado. I'd been working as a structural engineer for years, inspecting bridges, tunnels, anything the county deemed necessary. It was good work, quiet, routine, logical, exactly what I needed. No unexplained footprints in the dirt, no silent figures standing in the trees, just calculations, stress loads, and measurements. The tunnel was in the middle of nowhere, miles outside a dying town that barely had a name. It had been sealed off decades ago, left to rot when the old rail lines were abandoned. Now, the county wanted to assess it for safety, debating whether to restore or demolish it. I didn't care what they did, I just wanted the paycheck. The drive took hours, winding through dusty roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The land stretched on, empty and indifferent, the mountains rising in the distance like silent gods. I didn't pass another car. No signs of life, just the occasional rusted mailbox standing like a tombstone along the roadside. By the time I reached the tunnel, the sun was high, the heat pressing down like a weight. I parked near the entrance, dust billowing around the tires, and stepped out. The tunnel yawned before me, a massive concrete mouth swallowed by shadow. The entrance was overgrown, vines creeping along the cracked surface. A rusted chain-link fence had been hastily cut open, the metal curling like fingers where someone had forced their way through. I grabbed my flashlight, my tools, my notebook. I'd be in and out. Simple job. Inside, the air was different. Stale, thick, carrying a scent that reminded me of something long dead. My boots echoed against the ground, the sound swallowed by the darkness ahead. The walls were covered in graffiti, old and new, layers of paint scarring the concrete. Then I saw them. The drawings. Not the usual graffiti. No tags, no names, no crude jokes. These were faces. Hundreds of them. Twisted, stretched, mouths gaping in silent screams. Some were scribbled frantically, overlapping as if the artist couldn't stop. Others were deeply carved into the concrete, as though someone had spent hours, days, etching them with shaking hands. I swallowed hard and kept walking. Further in, I found the remnants of a camp, an old sleeping bag, torn and stained. Food wrappers, empty water bottles, a rusted lantern. Someone had been living here. Maybe still was. That's when I heard it. A shuffle. A slow, dragging movement from deeper in the tunnel. I froze, my breath catching. My flashlight trembled as I raised it, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Anyone there?" My voice echoed back, too loud, too alone. Silence. I exhaled, forcing a chuckle, probably an animal, a coyote, maybe just the wind pushing debris. Then the whisper came. My name. Soft, almost affectionate. I turned, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The flashlight flickered, the tunnel stretching out before me, endless and empty. No one there. The air felt heavier now, pressing in like a living thing. I swallowed, gripping my tools tighter. Get the measurements, get out. I moved deeper. The darkness thickened, swallowing the light. Every step felt wrong, like the tunnel itself was shifting around me, warping in ways I couldn't see. Then I heard the footsteps, not mine, ahead of me, slow, deliberate, coming closer. My mouth went dry. My hand hovered over my hip where my pistol rested in its holster, a precaution I always took on jobs like this. I'd never had to use it. I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to use it. I took a step back. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, thick as tar. Then, a shadow moved. Not a flicker, not a trick of the light. Something stepped forward just beyond my flashlight's reach. Tall, wrong, it didn't walk, it flowed. Like the darkness itself was coalescing into a shape, stretching from the walls, the ceiling, the ground. My grip tightened on the flashlight. I lifted my pistol, aiming at the darkness. "Stay back," the thing grinned. It didn't have a face, but I felt it. A smile, stretching wider, stretching too far. The whisper came again, curling around me like breath against my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I fired. 32. And the next one, red, blue. The gunshot roared through the tunnel, deafening in the confined space. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. The bullet had hit nothing. The tunnel shook. The walls groaned as if something beneath them was stirring. The faces in the graffiti twisted, their mouths widening, their eyes sinking into darkness. The whisper came from everywhere now, a chorus of voices, laughing. I ran. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember shoving through the rusted fence or the burning in my lungs as I sprinted to my truck. But I remember looking back. The tunnel was still, empty, but it was watching. I could feel it, pressing against my mind, stretching toward me with invisible fingers. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down that empty road, kicking up dust, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I reported the tunnel as unstable, unsafe. I made sure it was sealed properly, this time, reinforced with concrete, buried beneath layers of stone. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I still hear the whisper late at night, when everything is quiet. Sometimes I wake up gasping for air, certain that something is standing in the shadows, waiting. And sometimes I dream of the tunnel, of a mouth, stretching open, waiting to swallow me whole. I tried to forget about the tunnel. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the mind can play tricks when it's surrounded by darkness for too long. But something followed me out of that place. Not physically, but in the way I felt in empty rooms, in the silence of my own apartment, in the way shadows stretched just a little too far at night. I needed to clear my head. That's how I found myself on the road, driving across the country with no real destination, just miles of empty highways, cheap diners, and the kind of solitude that should have felt freeing but instead felt dangerously quiet. I drove west, stopping when I needed to, picking motels at random, places just off the highway, anonymous and forgettable, the kind of places where no one asks questions, where the walls are thin and the neon signs flicker like dying stars. That's how I found the Sunset Inn. It was late, nearly midnight, and I was too tired to keep driving. The sign glowed weakly in the dark, its buzzing fluorescent letters spelling out vacancy in a dull orange glow. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered near the building. I stepped inside, greeted by the musty scent of old carpet and a man behind the counter who barely looked up as I approached. He was older, his skin pale and waxy under the dim light. His fingers drummed absently against the counter, as if he'd been sitting there for too long. "Room for the night?" I asked. He slid the guest book toward me without a word. The pen was old, the ink fading, like the pages hadn't been touched in years. I signed my name, my fingers hesitating as I flipped through the previous entries. No dates. No checkout times. Just names. Some were crossed out, others had no last name. Some had only initials. I swallowed, sliding the book back toward him. "Room 17, he said, his voice flat. His hand trembled slightly as he grabbed the key from the rack behind him. "End of the hall, no smoking, no pets." "Got it," I muttered, taking the key. His fingers lingered on it for just a second too long before he let go. The hallway smelled like dust and old linen. The walls were a dull shade of beige, the kind that had once been white but had absorbed years of cigarette smoke and neglect. Dim, yellowed light bulbs flickered above, casting jittery shadows. Room 107 was at the very end, past a few closed doors that felt unused. There was something off about the place. Something about the air. It was still, like the building had been sealed off from the world for too long. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was exactly what I expected. Small, outdated, with a bed that sagged in the middle and a television that looked like it hadn't worked since the late 90s. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, curling like dried skin. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, rubbing my face. The exhaustion was catching up to me. I didn't even bother to change, just kicked off my boots and laid back, staring at the ceiling. Something about the quiet didn't feel right. There were no sounds of other guests, no muffled conversations, no TVs playing in the background, just silence. Then came the first scratch, soft, faint, right against the door. I sat up, my heartbeat suddenly too loud in my ears. I waited, straining to listen. Scritch, 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 like fingernails dragging lightly across the wood. I stood slowly, stepping toward the door. My hand hovered over the knob. I didn't want to open it. Instead, I lowered myself down, just enough to peer under the crack at the bottom. Nothing, just darkness. I exhaled, shaking my head. It's nothing, just my mind playing tricks after too many nights on the road. I turned back toward the bed. The doorknob rattled violently. My stomach dropped. The metal twisted, jerking hard, as if someone was trying to force it open. I grabbed the chair from the corner and shoved it under the handle, my breath coming fast now. Then it stopped. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening. Nothing. I sat back down, staring at the door, at the flickering glow of the streetlight outside filtering through the thin curtain. The air felt wrong, heavy, like I wasn't alone. Then came the breathing. Not from the door, from right beside the bed. Slow, shallow, like someone trying to keep quiet. My fingers trembled as I grabbed my phone, fumbling for the flashlight. I turned it on, nothing, just the empty room. But I felt it. I wasn't alone. I swallowed, glancing toward the mirror on the far wall. The reflection was wrong. I was there, sitting on the bed, my phone in my hand, but the bed behind me wasn't empty. A handprint bloomed on the glass. On the inside, I bolted. I didn't bother packing. I didn't care about my things. I yanked open the door and ran, the hallway stretching too long, the air thick like molasses. I hit the lobby at full speed, but the man at the desk was gone. The guest book was missing. The door was locked. I slammed my fist against the glass. "Let me out!" No answer. No sound. Then, from behind me, breathing. Close. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see. I grabbed a chair and threw it through the glass. The sound shattered the silence, and I ran, barefoot, stumbling onto the pavement, gasping for air. When I looked back, the lobby was empty. The motel was gone, just an empty lot, the weeds swaying in the wind. I ran until I reached the main road, until I saw headlights in the distance. A trucker pulled over, asking if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I wasn't. I never found my bag, my wallet, my car. I checked maps, records, police reports. The Sunset Inn didn't exist, but I remember the room, the handprint, the breathing. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, gasping, heart pounding, I still hear the scratching at my door. I stopped taking long drives after that night at the motel. Something about the open road used to calm me, used to make me feel like I was in control of my own life. But after what happened in room 107, I realized the things that haunt you aren't always bound to places. Sometimes they follow you. For a while, I told myself I was being paranoid, but I started seeing things in the corners of my vision. Reflections that weren't mine in bathroom mirrors, the feeling of pressure on the mattress beside me when I knew I was alone. I needed to get away, to reset. That's why, when my brother Martin invited me to stay at a fishing cabin in a small coastal village in Maine, I said yes. I should have said no. I flew in from Chicago and he picked me up at the airport, his teenage son, James, in the back seat, earbuds in, lost in his own world. Martin smiled as he tossed my bag in the trunk. "You look like shit, man." "Thanks," I muttered, climbing in. "Seriously, you need this." He pulled out onto the road, heading north. No cell service, no internet, just good old-fashioned isolation, perfect for clearing your head. I forced a smile. I didn't tell him that was exactly what I was afraid of. The drive to the village took 2 hours. The farther we went, the fewer signs of life we saw. The landscape flattened, the air thickened with the scent of salt and rotting seaweed. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, turning the ocean into a sheet of black glass. The village was small, too small. No gas station, no grocery store. Just a handful of weathered houses clustered near the docks. Everything looked abandoned, as if the ocean had swallowed whatever life had once been here. James took out one earbud, finally paying attention. "Where is everyone?" Martin shrugged. "It's off-season." The locals didn't look at us as we drove through town. I saw a woman pulling in her laundry, her movements quick, nervous. A man at the docks, staring out at the water, hands gripping the rail too tightly. "Is this place always this quiet?" I asked. Martin laughed. "That's the charm." But even he didn't sound convinced. The cabin was a short drive from the village, perched on a rocky stretch of coast where the waves crashed violently against jagged cliffs. It was old, but sturdy. The wooden docks stretched out over the water, the planks gray and splintered with age. The air tasted like salt and something else. Something metallic. We unloaded our bags, got the fire going, and sat outside with beers as the sky darkened. For the first time in a while, I almost felt normal. Then the fog rolled in. It came in fast, swallowing the horizon, creeping onto the shore like something alive. The air grew thick, suffocating, muffling the sound of the waves. James shivered. "That's unnatural." Martin waved him off. "It's just fog." But even he was watching it too closely. I tried to shake the feeling, but something about the way it moved made my stomach turn. It didn't drift, it pulsed, like it was searching for something for us. That night, we locked the doors and went to bed early. The cabin creaked in the wind, the sound almost rhythmic, like footsteps pacing the dock. I woke up to something worse. James whispering, "Dad, there's someone outside." I sat up, heart hammering. Martin was already at the window, peering through the gap in the curtain. He didn't move. "Martin?" I whispered. Slowly, he turned to me. His face was pale. "Come look." I didn't want to, but I did. The fog was thicker now. swirling around the dock in heavy, writhing tendrils. And at the very end of the dock stood a man. At least, it looked like a man. Tall, motionless, his back to us. James swallowed hard. "Who is that?" No one answered. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, facing the ocean, like he was waiting for something. Then he turned. My breath caught in my throat. His face was wrong. His skin was too pale, almost translucent. His eyes were hollow, sunken pits of blackness, and his mouth, God, his mouth, was stretched into an unnatural, lipless grin. Martin stumbled back from the window. James let out a strangled gasp. The man in the fog smiled wider. Then the whispers started. Not from him, from the fog itself. Dozens of voices, layered, overlapping, some soft, some desperate, some screaming. James grabbed my arm, his fingers ice cold. "We need to leave." We backed away from the window, moving toward the door. I reached for the handle. The whispering stopped. So did the creaking. The night was silent. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, wet, coming up the dock. James shook his head violently, his breath coming in short gasps. "No, no, no, no." I grabbed him, forcing him toward the back door. "We're leaving, now." Martin didn't move. He was staring at the front door, at the shadow pressed against it from the outside. Not knocking, just waiting. "Martin," I hissed. He blinked, snapping out of it. Together we shoved open the back door and bolted for the truck. The fog closed in around us, swirling, thickening. The whispers came again, closer now, echoing in our heads. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The truck roared to life just as something slammed against the back of the cabin. We tore out of there, gravel spitting under the tires. I looked back only once. The man in the fog was standing at the edge of the dock again, but now he wasn't alone. Figures were rising from the water, their hollow eyes locking onto us. Their grins stretched wider, the whispers screamed. We didn't stop driving until the sun came up. By the time we reached the nearest town, the fog was gone. The ocean was calm, the village had vanished. No houses, no docks, no people, just an empty stretch of coastline. We never spoke about it, we never went back. But sometimes late at night, I dream of that fog, of the whispering voices. And when I wake up gasping, my heart pounding, I swear I can still hear the waves. I didn't talk to Martin or James after we left the village. It wasn't that we were mad at each other. How could we be? We all saw the same thing. But some things shouldn't be spoken aloud. Some memories should stay buried, locked away in the back of your mind where they can't reach you when the lights go out. I went back to work, back to my routine, pretending that the world still made sense. But every so often, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart hammering, certain that if I opened the window, I'd see that fog creeping toward me again. That's when I got the call from Laura. She was an old friend, a real estate agent in Texas, one of those people who never stayed in one place for long. We hadn't talked in a while, so when she reached out, I assumed it was just to catch up. Her voice was different, though. Tight, shaken. "I need you to come down here," she said. "Something's wrong with this house." I almost told her no. I should have, but I owed her. The house was in a small town outside of Austin, sitting on a lonely stretch of Sycamore Street. It had been foreclosed years ago, passed from bank to bank, no one willing to touch it. Every buyer backed out, every renter left in the middle of the night. Laura was sent to evaluate it, finalize paperwork for yet another sale, but something about the house had gotten to her. When I pulled up, the place looked normal, but not falling apart. 2 stories, classic Victorian style, the kind of house you'd see in one of those fixer-upper reality shows. The windows were dark, too dark even in daylight. Laura was sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel like she was trying to anchor herself to reality. I knocked on the window. She flinched. "You okay?" I asked. She swallowed hard and nodded. "You shouldn't have stayed the night." I frowned. "What happened?" Her hand tightened on the steering wheel. "Come inside, I'll show you." The second I stepped through the front door, I felt it. The air was heavy, pressing down on me like a lead blanket. The house smelled of dust, old wood, and something else. Something faintly sour, like mildew soaked deep into the walls. The furniture was covered in white sheets, a half-hearted attempt to preserve what was left. Sunlight streamed through the cracked blinds, but it didn't reach the corners. The shadows felt deeper here. Laura led me to the living room, where she had set up a folding table, piles of paperwork stacked around her. She pointed at the fireplace. "Look at the wall." At first I didn't see it, just old wallpaper, faded and peeling. Then I stepped closer. Scratch marks. Hundreds of them. Not random. Deliberate. I reached out, running my fingers over the grooves. The scratches were deep, carved into the wood beneath. They weren't done with a knife. They weren't done with anything sharp. They looked like they were made with fingernails. Laura folded her arms. "They weren't there yesterday." I turned to her, my stomach twisting. "Are you sure?" Her face was pale. "I didn't sleep much, but I know what I saw. And I know that last night, they weren't there." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Laura, who else has been in this house?" She hesitated. Then, almost too softly, she said, "I think it's still here." The words sent a pulse of something dark through me. "Where did you sleep?" I asked. She motioned toward the stairs. "Second floor. Master bedroom." She led the way, her steps slow, hesitant. The upstairs hallway was worse. The air was thicker, the shadows clinging to the walls. There were no mirrors, just empty spaces where they had once hung, like someone had taken them down on purpose. When we reached the master bedroom, I froze. A chair sat in the middle of the room, facing the closet. I swallowed. "Laura, did you put that there?" She shook her head. "It was here when I arrived." I took a slow step forward. The closet door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I reached out, gripping the edge of the door. Laura held her breath. I pulled it open. Nothing, just an empty closet. But the air inside was cold, like it had been sealed away from time itself. Then I saw the marks. Not on the floor, on the ceiling. Scratch marks, just like the ones in the living room. Laura stepped back, shaking her head. "I heard something last night, scratching. I thought it was rats, but..." I didn't let her finish. We needed to leave, but something didn't want us to. The closet door slammed shut on its own. The chair toppled over. The air turned frigid, and a sound rose from the darkness. A slow, dragging inhale, like something waking up. Laura grabbed my arm. "We have to go." We ran. Down the stairs, through the living room, past the fireplace where the scratches seemed deeper now, almost moving in the corner of my eye. We made it outside, slamming the door behind us. Silence. The house sat there, still and empty, like it had never made a sound. Laura was shaking. "I'm done. I'm never coming back here." I nodded. "You shouldn't." Neither of us spoke as we got into our cars. I started my engine, ready to pull away, ready to leave it all behind, but I couldn't help myself. I looked back, and I saw it. A figure standing in the master bedroom window, tall, too tall. Its arms were too long, its fingers twitching, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was smiling. I hit the gas. Laura left the town that night, breaking her lease, abandoning her job. The house was listed again. No one bought it. It's still there, waiting. And every so often, someone drives down Sycamore Street and sees a dark figure watching from the upstairs window, still smiling. There's something terrifying about isolation. Whether it's a remote lodge in the mountains, a hidden river deep in the woods, or an empty house that's been waiting too long for someone to return, the fear always comes back to the same thing: being alone yet not alone. I've told you 6 stories tonight. 6 stories of people who thought they were just escaping for a weekend, just passing through, just doing their jobs. 6 stories of places that don't forget, that don't let go. If there's one thing to take away from these tales, it's this: some places were never meant to be visited. Some doors should never be opened. And when something tells you to leave, listen. Ethan, Rachel, Matt, Julia, and Chris learned that a cheap rental in the woods wasn't a getaway. It was a trap set long before they arrived. Noah and Daniel found out that some rivers hold more than fish, and that the things watching from the shoreline don't always stay there. Vincent thought he was inspecting an abandoned tunnel, but what he really walked into was a mouth waiting to close behind him. Olivia just needed a place to rest her head. But that motel? It had been waiting for her and Martin, and James thought the fog was just weather. But some things hide in the mist, and once they see you, they don't forget. And Laura? Laura was just doing her job, but that house on Sycamore Street? It wasn't empty. It never was. So what's the lesson here? Trust your instincts. If a place feels wrong, it probably is. If the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, if the silence feels too heavy, if you hear footsteps where there shouldn't be any, leave and don't look back, because sometimes looking back is exactly what they want you to do. To everyone who's listened, who's stayed with me through these terrifying journeys, thank you. Your support means everything. Every like, every comment, every share keeps this channel alive, keeps these stories coming. If you've had your own experience with the unexplained, tell me. Let's share these stories together, because in the end, fear is always easier to bear when you're not carrying it alone. And most importantly, stay safe out there, because in the middle of nowhere, you're never as alone as you think.